Welcome to Let's Talk Democracy, the show where we have meaningful conversations on democracy. I'm your host, Tina Johnson. And each week, we're joined by people who are doing the hard work of building healthy democratic environments. With insightful guests, expert advice, and thought-provoking conversations, we dive deep into the heart of democracy. Whether you're here to learn or to get inspired, we've got something for you. Let's jump in and explore today's episode. In today's episode of Let's Talk Democracy, we explore the dynamic relationship between climate policy and grassroots action, diving into how local mobilization can spark change on a national and even global scale. We'll reflect on the ever-shifting landscape of climate activism, the setbacks and progress across different political administrations, and why community-level engagement is essential for building real power, emphasizing the strength of collective action and solidarity across diverse identities and social classes to drive systemic transformation. I'm joined today in conversation by sociologist Dana R. Fisher, director of the Center for Environment, Community, and Equity, and professor in the School of International Service at American University. She's also the author of Saving Ourselves and American Resistance. Together, we'll be exploring climate, democracy, and the power of local action. Let's get into it. Hi, Dana. Thanks for joining me on today's podcast. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you for having me, Tina. It's great to be here.
I'm really excited to talk to you about the intersection of your work around climate change and what's going on in our democratic crises, if you want to call it, problem child. I'd like to kind of put a little humor there, and how you see these your work evolving in the current context that we're seeing in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, so my work has spanned, or as some people have said, my work has straddled between climate policy making and democratic engagement for my whole career. So, and the funny thing is, like, historically, I used to do a thing where, I would write a book and do a project around climate policy making. The climate policy would fail. It would become depressing. People would rise up, and I'd end up out in the streets collecting data and trying to understand how they were trying to push back and demand social change. And it was not only about climate, but climate was certainly one of the big types of activism that I was following. And then I would go back again, then the movement would be somewhat successful, and then there'd be another attempt, right? And so it was this back and forth. And somewhere along the way, actually, the activism and the climate work started merging together more seriously. And I guess that happened really around 2020 when the Biden administration came into office. I mean, before that, I was working on a book around the resistance called American Resistance, which is all about the first Trump administration and its policies. Climate was in there, but it was only part of it. It was really all about how the outrage against the Trump administration channeled people from the streets into electoral policy making in the districts. And I tracked that through people who were protesting, but then also all of these resistance groups that sprung up to try to channel and focus people's outrage into specific types of activism. Since then, when Biden won in 2020, I ended up tracking the Inflation Reduction Act. I studied climate policy making, and so I did it by surveying policymakers in what we call the Climate Policy Network, and tracked how come the Inflation Reduction Act actually passed when so many bills had failed before. I wrote Saving Ourselves, which was my most recent book. And for Saving Ourselves, it started from my frustration about the fact that I kept bouncing back and forth between studying and documenting how climate policymaking was trying, but then watching it fail, and then watching people rise up, and then seeing how the climate movement was trying to channel frustration into more disruptive forms of activism. And so that's what Saving Ourselves is really about. It's about what's needed to get us to the other side of the climate crisis and the role that civil society will play in it. And since the Trump administration won, obviously people are back in the streets protesting like they weren't during the Biden administration. So, we have this swing back. But one of the things that that comes out of saving ourselves is a lot of people ask me what would happen if Trump won in terms of where we were and where I saw us going. I was very critical of the Biden administration, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the climate action we saw out of the Biden administration. Not to say that it wasn't better than we'd seen in previous administrations, but just to point out that it was so insufficient to get us where we need to go. I worked on and was a contributing author for the most recent IPCC. I mean, in all of the models and all the scientific knowledge we have. So I was very frustrated with that. And so I pointed out when the book came out that if Trump were to win, things were going to get bad. I mean, we knew that from Trump 1.0, but we also knew from Project 2025 that they were going to get bad and potentially like really bad, but that in a lot of ways that could stimulate the kind of climate action we really need because people were going to push back in a coalition that was more broad on the left. That's what we saw during Resistance 1.0. And so that's what I've been documenting since. I've been talking about it as how to save ourselves during a poly crisis, because what we're basically seeing is that the world is warming, things are getting a lot worse. There's a lot of reasons. Like there's lots of evidence that things are continuing to get much worse. The Copernicus Center just came out with new data that basically show that 2025 is going to be the second hottest year ever recorded, even though we're not in an El Nino, which means it shouldn't be, but it is because, the world is warming. The Trump administration is stopping all opportunities to continue to track data on this, which I think is driven by the idea that maybe if people don't know it's happening because we're not keeping track of it, people won't push back and complain as much. I don't think that's going to work that way. In Kentucky, there were these crazy tornadoes that hit in some places that had never been hit before. Many people died partially because some of the warning systems that historically are in place weren't working because the Trump administration has cut the funding for the National Weather Service. So the people who work the night shift, there was nobody working the night shift. So there were not the same warning systems that exist normally to warn people when tornadoes are touching down. Just terrible. So people are losing lives. I mean, and we're getting very close to hurricane season here. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
no. No, 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 don't be sorry. One of the things having worked in the, environmental space and on different sides, like on the side of groups organizing around climate change to big groups in DC trying to influence policymakers, there's always been this very clear demarcation where the lines are blurred on how activism and coalition building lack. They don't always align to create the momentum that you need for the push that you just spoke about towards getting climate action in particular, because groups cannot find a way to agree on the way in which they would go about doing that work, even though they're
100%.
fighting for the same goal in quotation marks, but coming at it from different perspectives. I'm wondering how you see that challenge, or call it a challenge, that challenge, and I'll call it a barrier, challenge and a barrier to actually getting to forward effective policy on climate change, resulting in the type of effort you need to see even under a Trump administration, where we know it's not possible to push the policy end of this. Uh,
Levers don't exist, right?
yeah, it doesn't exist.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of that, let's see. So, I've talked about and documented a bunch of ways that there was this rift in the climate movement that we saw very clearly during the Biden administration between kind of what I call, and I don't mean this in a critical way, but I'll call them the incrementalists, which were a lot of the big greens that were willing to support these kind of incremental policies like the Inflation Reduction Act, which were absolutely insufficient, but were better than nothing, versus those who felt like without systemic change, we need to be pushing for systemic change. And were very frustrated about those who were supporting an administration that wasn't even willing to talk about banning fracking or reducing like the build out of fossil fuel infrastructure, stuff like that. One of the things I think is interesting about the work that I've done in the past around the first Trump administration and thinking about coalition building is that one of the things we do know from research, and my research has documented this, is it's a lot easier to build coalitions when there's a common enemy. So so there's that's heartening during these very dark times. I mean, at the same time, I also know from my work and then lots of other people who have done this that the climate movement um, needs to be building solidarity across identity, orientation, and social class. And it has not, and it really needs to, and it has not figured out how to do that very well. I mean, there were moments in time where we saw some solidarity. Certainly after George Floyd was murdered in 2020, we saw a number of climate groups and other progressive groups coming out in the streets and joining in what ended up being the largest sustained period of protests in US history. But it was short lived, right? And today, we really need to see real coalition solidarity building, particularly when what civil society is facing right now is they're facing like a a dismantling of our democratic system in a lot of ways. People are losing their rights, they're losing their capacity to engage. A lot of those levers that usually exist for pushing for political action and communicating with and expressing your concern about policies that the government's involved in, they don't exist. I mean, the courts are like going crazy with trying to limit the power of the Trump administration. It's not working super great. So what do we do now, right? And I think that the answer is again in building solidarity. And I talk about this a lot in the end of Saving Ourselves about how we really need to create community and true solidarity that crosses these identities, orientations, and social classes. But I also talk about how it really needs to start at the community level. I think a lot of folks on the left have focused more on these kind of meso or national level in terms of trying to build power or build capacity. That works sometimes when you have the capacity to engage in lobbying. Right now, those kinds of avenues are completely closed to the left. So it's a waste of time, in my opinion. It's a waste of resources, it's a waste of energy. Instead, and I actually think that this is a lesson that I've seen in my work over like 20 years of doing this research, that the best way to build power is actually to start in your local community, not sending like people from blue states to purple states, but rather building capacity in your community. If you live in a community like I live in Maryland, right? Maryland is very blue. We have a lot of really strong policies, but we could have better policies. But building capacity in your community to push back against power and work through the federal system that we have that enables us to work at the local level, at the regional level, at the state level, before we get to the national level, that's where we can build power. And that's where there are opportunities still, because I think that the only way to push back against the Trump regime right now is with mass mobilization that involves real relational ties among people who are mobilized and motivated by a range of issues. I mean, certainly there's lots of outrage right now. There's also a lot of fear and there's a lot of despair. And the places where we can build power and feel like we have the capacity to make social change is in our communities if we invest there. And lots of people have not been doing that.
I think about this often is the fact that people forget that that politics are local. I just had this
Well,
conversation with Jackie Patterson, an episode before, around the localization of being politically engaged, because that's where you have the most direct influence. That's where you have the opportunity to actually engage in direct dialogue with your representatives and to force change in the way that you can at the federal level, because it is such a big beast. And also, it's really less about the state engagement. It's more about the federal policies or mandates that they put forward that then get enacted, depending on the state, of course, at the state level. And I think that there is a disconnect there because people really believe or have been, I consider marketing one of the greatest evils of democracy, is that we're marketed to, it's like, this is where the seat of power is, and therefore focus here while we go over here and dismantle all your rights at this level. And then
yeah.
people scramble. And right now there's a scrambling happening because there is no leverage in DC with the Trump administration to figure out how to engage or how to shore up resistance. And I'm always curious, and I've always asked this question in my different capacities: why don't we invest? Why don't funders invest? Why don't organizations invest in community on the ground work? Because we have seen that that is where the power building starts and has the most effect. and can be the most effective?
Well, I mean, I think it's wonderful. I mean, first of all, I'm a huge fan of Jackie's work, and I think it's wonderful to get to talk after her. I mean, those are all the questions. I mean, the answering the question of why people aren't investing in the local level is like it's one of the mysteries that baffles me to this moment. I mean, I have literally written 3 books that specifically say we need to do this. I mean, the first one was called Activism Inc. It came out in 2006. The subtitle of it is How the Outsourcing of Grassroots Campaigns is Strangling Progressive Politics on the Left. It was all about this. And it actually has a whole chapter that's about how politics are local and how we need to actually build social ties at the community level. And I've continued to tell that story in different ways with different data as we continue to move forward and we see the left losing over and over again. And it particularly is frustrating because, part of this is the problem of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party continuing to rely on these instrumental shortcuts that basically they argue turn out the numbers they need. Here's a secret that they may not realize is it doesn't actually work that great, right? Maybe they haven't figured it out yet, but it's not working so great. And it wastes so much energy and so much local power. One of the things that I talk about in Saving Ourselves is, this is a kind of a similar theme, is just that like one of the things that Democrats have relied on historically is parachuting in strangers to do locals work. And that's something that the Republican Party, I mean, I wrote about this in 2006 and it continues today. The Republican Party and the right has really spent a lot of time investing in creating these tentacles through and in communities, through people who are connected to one another. And it works really well when they need to get people out to do stuff because having somebody who's a neighbor of yours knocking on your door and asking something is really different from having some stranger who does it. And sometimes it can work. I mean, and certainly there is the whole math of the turnout campaign and how to run the field for federal politics. But that is bypassing and just kind of skipping all the grassroots where we really have our power and we can have our power. One of the things I talk about in Saving Ourselves, which I think helps build more knowledge about this and helps us to kind of feel it, is they talk about climate shocks, which are these climate change exacerbated extreme events that we're going to see more and more of, like the tornadoes that just happened, like big storms, like heat waves, right? And one of the things that we do know is that when these shocks hit, you can't really rely on strangers to help you. I mean, you can some. I mean, in the United States now, with the Trump administration limiting FEMA and defunding all of these states' capacities for emergency management, it's going to be a lot worse. We need to rely on our communities more and more than we ever did before because of that. And so when you say to me, why aren't people investing in it? I just don't know. It's so frustrating. And I think that the problem is that there are some folks who are really invested in this notion of thinking about politics, progressive politics, or at least left-leaning politics, as this kind of machine. And all they need to do is insert a certain amount of people power into it. And people power, I'll use my air quotes here, people power in terms of like doing what they need people to do and not really letting them create their own power and capacity. That involves actually listening to them and letting them demand what they think is most important for their communities. I mean, that's where you have this like relational, really thick infrastructure at the community level. And that's where social change can happen. And that's where we can get to what we need to get to, because we can demand it if we actually are building that into our politics. And politics should start with the people. But when you decide to just like jump from the people in your community all the way up to Washington, D.C., so much is missed. I mean, one of the heartening things that I've seen lately, and then I'll stop talking, is just is lots of people who have lost jobs in the federal government who are like, forget it, I'm going to run for public office in my community. I have a friend of mine from actually one of my oldest friends in the world who she was my next door neighbor growing up, who's in public health, and she's going to run for office in Pennsylvania where I live. Like all these people are like, it's enough already. We need to run for office and we need to build power at the local level. That's really heartening. And those are the kinds of things we can be doing right now, even though our federal government's being dismantled, even though so many of the best parts of our bureaucracy and the safety net are being dismantled. We still have that power. At least right now we do.
I think it was Janet Napolitano who said, if good people don't run for public office, then all it leaves are bad people to be public servants. So I think that if nothing more, people deciding after this that it's to not just their benefit, but to their community's benefit, to the benefits of democracy, to be more engaged, that's a win. It's a hard win to swallow because of
Yep,
the
yep.
process it's taken to get here, but that's a win. Something I've I've considered a lot is how the Democratic Party, unlike the Republican Party, has to be a lot of things to a larger tent. I've had this conversation with people where it's the Democrats, they need to improve their ground game. Absolutely. They need to really elevate and put forward the people that are going to be able to make those connections in the communities. And I think Obama did a really good job of that when he ran. That
Yeah, yeah,
is a
yeah.
prime example of community coming out, supporting, doing that work. But that has changed, and there are more progressives, more Democrats who are single issue voters who want the tent to be inclusive of their one issue and to try to then make that the platform for the party. And that makes it really challenging. Where, on the other hand, the Republicans, I feel, have done a much better job of saying, these are our three issues. And these are the things that we're going to focus on and we're going to make people care about. And people are going to get behind that, whether it's immigration, whether it's the budget, whether it's abortion, but these are it. And this is what we're going to do. And we're going to invest in that. The criticism is fair, but I think the expectation that we have that the Democratic Party should be the party of all of the things makes it really difficult for them to be able to put forward a platform and to put forward the resources that addresses all of those things. So how do they do this? I use the term right this ship because it is righting a ship that's
Mhm.
totally on its side.
Yeah, taking on water every moment, right? I mean, here's the problem. I completely agree with everything you said. I think the problem right now is, I mean, it's funny because I remember the Democratic National Convention this year, or like I guess it's last year now, when Harris took the nomination, and I knew so many people there, and the way that that process was really this symbolic process that didn't build off of what people were asking at the local level. People in different communities have different demands and different interests. The Democratic Party tries to be this broader tent. Absolutely. But that is just like another call for the need for local engagement and building ties into communities rather than trying to like skip the hard part of building local infrastructure. Because when you have local infrastructure in my community, it may be that specific issues are more of a priority here than they are in other communities. And if we were engaging in the local governance really and building those ties really, then the Democratic Party coming out of my part of Maryland would be able to be more engaged and speak to what is most necessary, and there would be more capacity to understand what everybody needs and what everybody wants, because instead of saying, "Oh, all of you folks," like, I live in Jamie Raskin's, congressional district, which and, very happy to be a Jamie Raskin supporter, but, the deal is that you should not be taking people in Jamie Raskin's district, and when we get to an election, say, "Now you guys should all go over to Virginia and canvass and support and try to pressure Virginia to go blue," which is what I've done and what I've been asked to do for years and years. What instead I think, I mean, and I get why it's easier to take people who are already supportive of that perspective and try to get them to go change hearts and minds. It takes so much more work to do that. And it doesn't work when you're coming up against a Republican Party that actually has built those ties into communities. And instead, what I think we need to do is everybody in their community should figure out what your priorities are. And then the Democratic Party has to figure out how to reconcile them. Really listen rather than having a bunch of people go to the convention. Everybody knows what the platform's already going to be, wide tent. We won't talk about Gaza, et cetera, and so forth. It doesn't work. It's necessary for the party. If the party is going to survive, the party is going to have to figure out how to do a better job of bringing in the people and actually representing what they care about.
Yeah, but as this year has started to unfold, it seems like on both sides, like the Republican side and the Democratic side, there is this question on about can these two parties as they currently exist continue the way that they've been going and survive if now you have post the election, new Trump administration, many people saying, I didn't vote for this, but
Mhm.
also people saying, well, I didn't vote for Kamala either, but I still support the Democrat. You know what I mean? Like there's this question of where these two parties go from here, if they are actually going to exist in any formation in the future. People are like, well, if Biden had dropped out sooner, Trump wouldn't be in office. And I always say that's BS.
Who
That's
the hell
BS.
knows? I mean, that's what I
Yeah,
would say. It's like, I
yeah,
mean, maybe, but I mean, there's lots of reasons why the Trump machine did a really good job of connecting people and, I mean, and convincing people that he wasn't gonna deport them and he wasn't gonna take away their rights and their resources, and, that may not have been
and
true. Maybe.
and that his response to COVID was somehow ignored. Do you know what I mean? Like there was a lot that people were just willing to just cover their eyes and say and ears and say, I'm okay with this guy because for whatever reason, I believe what I'm being sold. And
Right, I
so
mean,
we
and no, I was just gonna say, I mean, and there's lots of stuff that's come out about the media environments and our media diets and how people have become siloed and how right-leaning media has done a really good job of marketing Trump through what's it called? True Social, through X, through Fox. I mean, there's like a whole amazing network of media, which I have family that like they only feast on that media, those media sources, and they're getting completely different information than the rest of us are. And it makes it easy to close your eyes, hold your ears, and just continue to support somebody who lies to you constantly. It's really problematic. I mean, if the question is, do I believe if we can continue with this two-party system and America can survive in any way that is democratic or looks anything like the America that I grew up in? I think the answer is probably no. But what comes next is really, I mean, it's up to us, but it's going to be a really scary jump. But I also think that we are teetering on the precipice of some really scary times here in the United States based on what my research is showing and just what we know from, like, history, because we are seeing so many rollbacks of so many rights, so many people losing their jobs. I mean, the Washington Post was just reporting that, homes on the market here in the DC area are, like, up way more than they have ever been because so many people have lost their jobs. I mean, it's just interesting because we were taking my son to school the other day. We were looking at and counting how many houses are for sale in the neighborhood. I mean, and it's happening throughout the DC area. And I realize DC is not like the rest of the country in that way, but I do know that schools, universities that receive funding from the federal government are all losing their funding. States that receive federal funding from the government are losing their funding and are not able to pay for for all these welfare policies, but also to pay for their universities. I mean, there are gonna be some very hard times here. A lot of people are saying, I mean, I'm not an economist, I'm a sociologist, but a lot of people are saying that we are about to feel the effects of the tariffs, which we haven't yet seen. I mean, I've seen pictures of the lack of container ships many places. I think we've all seen those, but we haven't yet seen how it's gonna affect our economy. And that's still to come. So I think things are gonna get a lot worse before they get better here, but I think we need to be thinking about, manifesting how we're gonna save our democracy and what democracy should be looking like in the United States, and the role that climate change and addressing climate change addressing the climate crisis needs to play in that.
yeah, I think the idea that the two-party system and whether we evolve that into a multi-party system is intriguing because it does make sense in regards to creating more avenues where people feel that there are options for their voice, their agendas, their ideas to actually live out in more clear and precise ways where you can actually have a policy position and there could be a party that says this is what we do instead of it being wrapped up into someone else's watered down version of that. But that said, in the current iteration of the state of the US executive branch,
Mhm.
let's put it there, where people are being directly impacted regardless of party, regardless of whether they voted or not. where is the alignment for folks to say we need to start having these discussions before we get to saying, let's have a multi-party system, right? We have to start having the discussion that we see that we're in a democratic crisis, but we also understand that there's some disconnect here between what we as just citizens expect and should expect from our government and what's happening, which is not party now, right? It's not
Right, right, right.
party. It's actually governance. In that sense, what do you think, or how do you think that conversation is started, or where can that conversation begin for folks? So then we can start talking through, well, how do we change it? What are the amendments to the Constitution that can be made to create a more modern version of our constitutional democracy? But there's a
I mean,
step
I think
first.
yeah, the first step is that we have this real problem right now that the elected officials who are not in the executive branch are not raising their voices in ways to push back against the illegal power grab that's been taking place, right? Particularly Democratic members of Congress.
We can just say it. They're not doing their damn jobs.
No, they're not doing their damn jobs. And it's interesting because here in DC, so I study protests, collected data out at many, many protests that we've had so far this year. And I've seen a lot of elected officials, including, Schumer. I've seen Maxwell Frost. I've seen Jamie Raskin. I've seen a number of elected officials go to offices that are being shut down or occupied by Doge, insisting that they get let in, being told they can't get let in, and leaving. And that is not representing the people, and that is not pushing back against a power grab that is illegal. We have seen a little bit of that in Newark, and that's really the only place we've seen it so far. But that is what elected officials should be doing right now. Booker taking a stand and, staying up all night giving a speech. Okay, speeches are great, but at this point, we need to be doing more than yelling into the void, right? We need to see our elected officials actually doing something. A month ago, I would just be like screaming about how I would like to see the elected officials getting arrested. Like, they should demand to be allowed to have their rights as elected officials, no matter their party. That's how our democracy works. There are checks and balances. Right now, all of these agencies are being shut down and being denied their congressionally appropriated funding. I have many friends who have lost jobs. All these scientific offices of the federal government have been closed. Those were all congressionally appropriated. The executive branch is not allowed to do what it's doing, which the courts are saying. And the courts are, in many cases, pushing back against this. But where is our Congress, right? I would say that the first thing that has to happen is we need to see the elected officials doing their job. If they're not going to do their job, they should be replaced. And that is where we come in as people. But people need to demand that. Now, part of the reason that I think that they're not doing their job is because first of all, the job has gotten a lot harder because it's not as symbolic as it has been historically. I also think that it's because of the role that we've seen in corporate funding for campaigns. That means that a lot of elected officials are being very careful, too careful. They're more concerned about the people who donate to their campaigns, or not the companies that donate to their campaigns, and they do the people they ostensibly represent. And that has to end. The idea that we can imagine creating an updated version of American democracy that actually works for the people without people who have been elected into the government stepping up and actually demanding that they get to do their jobs and follow through on what they are supposed to be doing and that they have been elected to do. The only other way beyond that is where the people go into the streets and refuse to go back into their homes. Those are the only ways forward. Because it's not like we can just sit here, drink Chardonnay, watch Netflix, and it'll all be over soon. It's not going to work that way. I wrote about this a little bit in American Resistance, which came out before Saving Ourselves, around the first Trump administration. But there was this expectation that if everybody did their part and this distributed campaigning and calling random people in purple areas and reminding them how bad the Trump administration was, the blip in our history that was the Trump administration would go away and we wouldn't have to think about it anymore. And everybody just went back home and sat on their couches and watched, Bridgerton or whatever, right? I mean, and there were lots of reasons for that. And I know engaging in democracy is hard, and I don't really want to be out in the streets all the time. I don't want to be spending all my time making sure people I vote for are actually following through on their campaign promises. But unfortunately, that's what our democracy requires right now. And I think that there are only two ways out of this. Because if people basically get terrified or exhausted or outraged and depressed and just go home and stay inside, the next time they come outside to look at what America has become, it's not gonna look anything like the America that they thought they were living in. I mean, we're already seeing that. Got like we got banners with Donald Trump's face hanging off federal buildings. Because
I heard about them. Yeah. But can you say again what those 2 options are?
yeah, okay, so the two options are either we as Americans figure out how to get our elected officials to stand up and push back against this power grab that the Trump administration is taking, right? Elected officials in the minority are actually given a lot of rights and capacity to make change and to push back and hold the line as elected officials, even if they're in the minority. The Republicans do a good job of that when they're in the minority. The idea that the Republicans would have just been told, no, you're not allowed into the Department of Education or the U.S. Institute of Peace or USAID, like list all of the agencies where a Doge has come in and there's been this symbolic, like, let me in, and then they're not allowed in, they leave. The Republicans wouldn't have left. They would have demanded, they would have stayed, they would have pushed their way in. That is what elected officials should be doing right now. They should stop the power grab. And if they don't, people who elected them need to get rid of them. And the people need to insist that their elected officials do that. Because some of these elected officials are like, oh, well, the people need to be demanding it. They should be out in the streets getting arrested. And it's like, why? Why don't you go do your job? You appropriated and approved of specific congressional appropriations. That's Congress's job. If somebody is taking away those appropriations that you approved and determined in your job, you need to stop. So that's number one. I don't know how legit, like how feasible that is, but in a lot of ways, it's easier to try to pressure your local congressperson and senator to do their job than it is to try to change what's happening nationally, right? So that's option one. Option two, if that doesn't happen, I mean, I think if that doesn't happen, we're going to see people flooding the streets and refusing to go back in their homes. I think that because so many people are going to be hit on all sides through ICE, through the federal cuts, through people losing their jobs, through the economy and how the economy is about to turn. And then we're going to get hit with all of these extreme weather events because, if you look at predictions that scientists have made, many of them not in the United States, where they still are allowed to collect those kinds of data that they need to make these predictions, this hurricane season is supposedly is going to be very bad. And if the hurricane season is really bad, and the Trump administration has cut the funding for all the people who predict so that they can warn communities when they need to evacuate, more lives are going to be lost. And one of the things that, we know is that when people are hit with climate shocks, they demand more climate action. And if you cannot get support for that, people who are desperate are going to start to push harder, even if there's repression. And we're already seeing repression grow in the United States.
So one is to get the people that have been elected at that very low level of engagement that citizens are asked to do, which is by voting, do your job. Or two, people will get into the streets and demand that there be change.
The one thing I would just say is when we're talking about getting in the streets, I think it is important to say that, like, well, I think it's great that we're seeing these broad coalitions forming to get people out in the streets on a Saturday. When I say this, I don't mean go march on a Saturday and then go home, because that is not enough to push back against the kind of power grab that we're seeing.
No, I mean, part of the resistance and the building of power is sustaining power, right? It's
Mhm.
how do you build that? So yes, you have the march, but when you finish that march, it's what is the next action? How are we engaging? Who are we putting out and supporting to be on school board or to run for state representative? Or so there's a lot of that nuanced engagement that I do feel has been lost because there is sort of this feeling of we can take a deep breath. Our democracy is safe. It's the oldest democracy in the history of the world. And therefore, all is right. And we know that it's not. And so I think people are now having to figure out in a broader way of what it means to be part of a struggle to get the things that are promised to you in the
Yeah.
Constitution of the United States.
The one thing I just say is that I think that we need to also remember that there's a whole bunch more tactics in the toolbox of engagement beyond just peaceful marching in the streets. And I think that there's going to come a time very soon where we need to start to broaden those tactics. And I'm talking about general strikes. I'm not talking about violence. I'm talking about peaceful resistance, general strikes. There's all sorts of types of civil disobedience that are possible and may be necessary to really get the message out. I mean, research we know from the civil rights movement, from the movement to end apartheid in South Africa, from the struggle for women's suffrage, involve a whole diversity of tactics that are not just going out on a Saturday and holding a sign and marching. I mean, those are great. That's a good way to create the sense of collective identity, to help you feel like you're not alone, to help you find similarly minded people and figure out how to work with them in a more sustained struggle. But it can't just be go out there one day with your sign and go home. It just can't be.
Yeah, I think the sustained effort to address the moment has to have a vision for what the sustained effort is for. And perhaps that's where we get to the question of how do we advance our democracy to be more inclusive around how we're governed, whether it's a two-party system, which isn't the prerequisite to have American constitutional democracy. We don't
Right,
need
right,
to
right.
have a two-party system. So it can be multi-party. That is an option without having an amendment to the Constitution, right? Like, I think people don't realize that it's not written in the Constitution that it's a two-party system.
Yeah.
And so, but I think that sustained effort and that understanding that there is a goal. Like, you've written about this. I've participated in the backroom processes for the People's Climate March. And I said this to folks. I'm like, okay, we're gonna get all these people marching. What for? Really? Like, what are we asking people to do when they leave this space? What are they going to be asked to really take home to build power with? And folks are like, "Well, we hadn't thought about that." I'm like, "This is the stuff you need to think about because
Mm.
this is where people really are willing. If they're willing to come into the streets, they're willing to build power together. But if
Yep.
we don't ask them to build that power, if they don't have avenues to build that power, then we're just wasting a lot of energy, time, and resources." And for me, although it was a success on the day that it happened, I think this is a prime example of not having a sustained vision that
Mhm.
supports the sustainability of people's willingness to fight for what they believe is right and just. How do we get there? I mean, we do have all of these toolbox pieces that we can grab and assimilate, but it feels like there's, again, that just a disconnect that we can scroll and like, or we can donate online or sign a petition, but that on the ground really organizing and putting forth a vision is the thing I feel is lacking. And I have asked this question, what's the process to get to that for people who really want to see change?
Yeah, I think that what it requires is people finding groups that are working on the ground or building groups that are working on the ground. I mean, there are some really good ones out there. I mean, including the Working Families Party, which I think is expanding a lot of the areas where they're working, and they are working to combine labor with progressive change in meaningful ways. There are lots. The unions are becoming much more vocal, even though certain unions like the federal workers unions are losing a lot of power right now. But unions are a prime place to find opportunities to think through how you could build more capacity and power for change, and thinking about the kinds of tools that can be used for that. I mean, Indivisible is doing a great job of expanding once again. I believe that it now has chapters in every congressional district. My interpretation is it is the largest proponent of this No Kings Day of Action that's going to happen on June 14th, where if you look at what they've got posted already, people from across the country are planning for actions, and they do have it connected with a toolbox of types of actions people can take in their local communities. And that's what's needed is groups that are thinking about that, thinking about building local power and connecting the local power up through the federated system to the national level, so that it's not just come and march in DC. In fact, on June 14th, they're not marching in DC because President Trump is having a military parade here. You can't get a permit. So, yeah, I don't even know what to say about that. So we'll just move away from that one.
Yeah. That
Yeah.
w I'm baffled by that myself. I'm just like, "What?" And
I mean, there are lots of rumors among activists here in DC about there being efforts underway to have some Tiananmen Square type moments with, people standing, holding out daisies to tanks and such. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm kind of happy I'm going to be away on fellowship at the time because it could get really messy. But all of that being said, if we think about building from scratch, it's really hard to imagine how we build the kinds of structures we need, the infrastructure we need at the local level. But instead, I actually think that what we should be doing is looking for places where that structure already exists and helping to build it out in our communities. I just listed a couple, but there are so many. I mean, historically, there are, PTAs. One of the places that I thought was really interesting to think about, and I spoke a lot about in the past few years, is the role that libraries played around COVID in terms of information dissemination, but also supporting people in your community during COVID and distributing, was it PPE? Is that what personal protective equipment? Yeah, PPE and COVID tests and all that. Libraries could be so much more. And libraries are already in some ways on the front line here of these, we can call them the woke wars. I don't know what we want to call them, right? Because they're basically defending being allowed to have books and scientific information for the people who live in the communities, but they're already community embedded. So anyway, so I think that there are places like that, but finding people who are willing to take the time to build that capacity at the local level. And capacity means connecting people, getting them together to do more than just scroll and like things. I still stand by. I have colleagues who believe that you can save the world online. I just don't believe that.
no, you can't. I don't believe that either. I think you can share information and resources online, but the actual contact, the actual conversation, the looking at each other in one another's eyes and understanding the other person's feelings and being able to express that compassion, you can't click that. And I
You
think that
can't
that in
click
my
compassion. I like it. I like that. Yeah.
but, like, in your experience, because you do a lot of work on the ground in communities, talking with people, I do that work. It's just it that is community, and that is where you solve problems together, and you start to understand each other's perspectives in a way that you cannot ascertain from a quick blurb on Facebook, right? Like, so I think that people who believe that, are lazy, I'll just say it, are
Yeah,
lazy.
yeah, yeah.
Right, like, it's lazy. But I think
Uh-huh.
the other challenge here, and we talked about it a little while ago, is that most people who do this work, who actually go into the communities, do not get paid for this.
Mhm.
They don't get paid, and the resources that need to be used to help elevate their work and their effort needs to move away from organizational support into community support, because that really is where you're going to have the biggest benefit and you're going to get the most bang for your dollar as a funder, is if you go into communities and say, let's fund the work you're doing, because it doesn't take $1 million. It might take 5,000, 10,000. Most
Yep.
folks aren't looking for their salaries to be paid. They're looking for help in paying for posters or helping a college student or a high school student get some money for doing some organizing for them. So it's a really low investment compared to the national investment in organizations, where we've just both agreed that the way we make the inroads is to actually organize in communities.
During the school strike movement period, right? And even more recently, I frequently am approached by funders who want me to tell them, quote, who to give money to because they just want to find something splashy and flashy where they give money and they can say, look, we're supporting me. And one of the things that's my pet peeve of late is the funding influencers who can make very nice, pretty posts online the evidence that that will actually can mobilize a movement or can get people connected on the ground and create democratic capacity, I haven't seen one bit of evidence that that's the case. I mean, I just finished teaching this spring a class on activism engagement in the environment, and the number of times that we all and I had a number of activist leaders who were students who were in my class, which was it was wonderful. The number of times we ended up, piling on to influencers, and the fact that the influencers were getting money, they were getting all of this access to the Biden administration with the idea that that was going to fix the election. All you need to do is bring in those influencers. I can tell you, I mean, my publicist made me do some talks for my book tour with influencers, and they couldn't bring out one person to sit in the seat. I mean, they would post thousands, tens of thousands of people. They would tell about, the conversation, tell them to come out. They didn't show up. I mean, but if they're not, I mean, granted, maybe they just didn't like me, but the argument that they are going to be able to get them to even go out and like vote is questionable. But certainly, I don't think that they're going to be able to get them to come out and actually, if they're not willing to like go and do something face to face, the idea that they're going to turn out and build capacity at the local level is really questionable. So I think we really need to turn away from that. And those that are shame on the foundations for not recognizing what's needed and meeting the moment properly.
Yeah, I think that meeting the moment properly is the call that we have at this time.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And I think it's this reevaluating, not just for ordinary citizens who do have a dog in this fight, but for those who fund these fights to really think
Oh yeah.
about how these dollars should be spent to support those who are willing to put literally their bodies on the line
Hmm.
to save democracy and to make it better. And so that's something that I mean, that's a hope I have. I have that even before the crisis that we're in right now with the second Trump administration, that somehow we see the value in elevating the lives and the work of those people who actually make us a better country by pushing us to do those things in a way that has a greater benefit for everyone.
Right.
And that's one thing I appreciate about your work and what you're doing is because you have a lot of passion in what you do. And it's obvious to me that you put yourself out there, not just in your books, but physically out there because you believe in the world, that it can be better, that it can do better. And I know that you call yourself
Apocalyptic optimist.
optimist, yes. And I want to ask you, are you still this?
Oh, I am still an apocalyptic optimist, but as I keep getting reminded by people, they're like, well, you said we had to go through the apocalypse. Well, here we are. Welcome to my apocalypse. Being an apocalyptic optimist means that I recognize when the main thing about being an apocalyptic optimist is that I am acutely aware of the fact that if we do not recognize, for lack of another way of saying it, like the shit we put ourselves into and how bad things are, we will not be able to get to the other side. And in a lot of ways, as I've argued other places, if we are not realistic about how bad things are, it opens up avenues and opportunities for misinformation, which we see on the left and the right. And the misinformation on the right we know a lot about, but on the left, it's this, oh, don't worry, if we invest more in carbon capture and storage, that's going to solve the problem. Technology will save us. Don't worry, we've got this new carbon absorbing cement. You can just keep going. Just go buy your big cars. I mean, like, that's also misinformation. It's not scientifically verifiable. And so I think it's really important to be realistic. It's also a hell of a bummer. And it means that some days I wake up and I feel really bad. And there's lots to feel bad about now. It means that sometimes it's hard to find the optimism, but I do believe in people power. I still believe that we can turn the ship around. Well, I guess we have to write it first, like you said. We got to write the ship and then turn it around. Before we just had to turn it around and it was a big ship. But now it's like we got to stand it up and then we got to turn it around. And I believe that people are going to rise up to push back in that way. I don't think it's going to be easy, and I'm not convinced it's going to be peaceful anymore. Not because the people pushing back to power are going to be violent, but because people in power are going to be violent against them. And there's lots of reasons why we've seen repression growing, right? Repression leads to escalation. Even though those in power think repression leads to people going back to being like, yeah, I'll just sit at home and It's going to be fine. That's not going to work that way when people are losing their jobs. Communities are being increasingly polluted. We're going to have climate shocks that are going to displace people, and people are going to be out, not only lose their jobs, but they're not going to be able to have homes to live in, food to eat, clean water to drink. I mean, those things make people they make people desperate. And I am optimistic that that desperation will lead more people to join the struggle and will cross a lot of these silos that we've been in to help us build solidarity. But it stinks. I hate that this is where we are. That I hate that we need to go through the apocalypse. I mean, like I said, and I say this like clearly in my TED Talk because they made me be clear. But in my TED Talk, I basically talk about how, the whole question is the earlier we push back against this power, and a lot of it goes back, if you follow the lines, to the fossil fuel interests and other corporate powers that are controlling our democracy right now and are driving the Trump administration. But the thing is that the sooner we figure out how to manifest our power and build those connections that we've been talking about at the community level, the faster we can stop what's happening and we can start to get where we need to go. The less lives will be at risk or lives will be lost to climate shocks and the devastation that this crisis of democracy is leading to. The longer we wait, the worse it'll be. The question that I keep trying to figure out, and I don't have an answer to it, and I'm not really sure exactly how to put a number on it. People constantly are asking me what the answer is. The answer is that we know that the sooner we act and the more we build real power, and power is defined as people connected to one another who have recognition of the types of tools that they can use to push back, the sooner we can start to stop this. And I don't know how far we're going to go, but I know that we're getting into the heart of the apocalypse right now. So I hope
But
we're getting close.
but in that optimism, because I agree with you on everything that you said, and I would just add, I cherish the idea that out of this, that there's rebuilding, and
Yes.
that rebuilding and that righting the ship and then changing direction means that there is an opportunity, many opportunities to create something better and more effective.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think there's a lot of evidence at this point that the other side of this crisis we're in, the poly crisis we're in, is not going to look like where we came from. And I'm hopeful about that because we really do need systemic change. We need systemic change to address the inequalities in our society that go beyond the climate crisis. And those types of changes are possible, but are going to take us doing that work. But that means that it's just those types of those type of opportunities need to open up to us, and I think that they can because so many people are going to be outraged and demand action. And maybe that's the activation energy, the motivation, the mobilization. Unfortunately, this is why I'm the apocalyptic optimist. I think that comes from a real personal sense of crisis. And here we are now. This is what I had said before the election. I said, well, if we get to a Trump administration, everyone's going to feel the crisis. The apocalypse is going to come a lot faster. It's terrible, but here we are. So now we get to experience the apocalypse. Now we can quantify how long it takes and what it really means. Yay!
Yay! Dana, thank you so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed our conversation. And again, I appreciate all the work that you're doing.
Thank you for having me. And as long as it's peaceful in the streets, I will continue getting out there and trying to share what we can learn from the people in the streets, even though I won't have any money to do it. So, here we go.
We'll find a way.
We will find a way. Exactly.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.
That brings us to the end of this episode of Let's Talk Democracy. A big thank you to Dr. Dana R. Fisher for sharing her deep knowledge and inspiring perspective on how grassroots movements can shape climate policy and strengthen democratic engagement. And thank you, Dana, for generously offering a discount on both Saving Ourselves and American Resistance exclusively for our listeners. You can find the link and discount code in the show's description box. As we've heard today, real change starts at the local level. with communities organizing, showing up, and holding systems accountable. Whether it's joining a local climate initiative, supporting grassroots organizers, stepping into public service, or simply having meaningful conversations that connect the issues you care about to democratic values, your voice truly matters. If you're feeling inspired, take that next step. Get involved in a local campaign, attend a town hall, or connect with organizations that are working on the issues that matter to you. Democracy thrives when we come together, and change doesn't happen in isolation. Thank you for listening. If you found this episode valuable, please share it with your community and leave us a review. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a conversation. And as usual, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback for me, send me an email to tina@patternchangelab.com. Join me next week as I take a moment to reflect, share key insights, and highlight the major takeaways from recent conversations with our Let's Talk Democracy guests. We'll dig deeper into the engaging themes of democratic resilience and explore the role each of us can play in building stronger, more inclusive democracies. Talk with you then.